Well, good morning, and thank you for having me here. There are a lot of opinions about the value of video games and what effects they may or may not have. My position is that this is what science is useful for. Most of these questions are answerable by science. Do they have an effect? Violent games have an effect on aggression? Can someone be addicted to them? These are all scientifically valid questions. My approach today is to give you an overview of a lot of the research that will help set the stage for the later talks today. And I do want to make sure you understand, we understand that people are different. Not everyone is affected exactly the same way by the same game. And a lot of the newer research is starting to show that the motivations gamers have can actually change the effects. And there are also many other types of effects that can influence what effects the games have. That said, my focus is on how people interact with games and how they can be influenced by the game design, and that these game design features actually have predictable effects. So there is a lot of research on video games. And it's on both what you might consider intentional effects, such as there are a number of studies now showing that if you create a video game to help people recognize their symptoms of, say, asthma or diabetes or some chronic health issue, the children and adults who play these games actually become much better at maintaining their own health care than if you gave them a brochure with exactly the same information. So something about the games seems to make it, I don't know, more motivating or a better teacher, and so people actually learn more from them. Also, there are now many, many studies showing that educational video games can have very positive effects. So if children are playing math games, they learn math skills. If they play reading games, they can learn reading skills. And so these first two you might think of as intentional effects. The games were designed to have these effects. But most of the research has actually been on unintentional effects. So there are a number of studies showing that if you play certain types of games, it can improve your visual and spatial attentional skills, at least to getting information off of a screen. So, for example, there are types of games, usually they're violent, but they call them action games, where you run around an environment, things can be behind you, above you, below you. You have to maintain your orientation and awareness of many different types of objects in your visual field. And because it has such a complicated environment, researchers hypothesized that maybe if you practice that, you would get better at spatial processing, maintaining some type of spatial awareness, that you would get better at picking up information off of a screen very quickly. And so one of the studies they did is they had people play these games for about, if I recall in this study, it was 10 hours. And then they gave them a task. And here's how the task works. You're looking at a computer screen, and there is a little cross on it, and you're just told to focus on that cross. And then at some point, letters begin flashing. Now, they flash very quickly, only for 15 milliseconds, and then they are screened out by a blank screen for 85 milliseconds, and then there's another letter, and then screened out. And there will be somewhere between 7 and 15 random letters. After the 7 to 15 letters, there will be a white letter. And then there will be 8 letters after the white letter. Half of the time, one of them will be an X. Your job, is there or is there not an X after the white letter? Are you ready? Was there an X after the white letter? How many of you say yes? How many of you say no? Well, the yeses are correct and probably play more games. Because what we find is that, yes, if they had played the games, they actually were much better at picking up this information quicker. Now, probably the most research has been done to date on violent games. And so in one of my studies with over 600 8th and 9th grade children in the US, we found that children who play more violent video games see the world in terms of hostility. That's what hostile attribution bias. It means that, if you get bumped in the school hallway, do you assume it was an accident or do you assume it had hostile intent? And of course, if you play a lot of violent video games, you're practicing being very vigilant for enemies. And so if they play more violent video games, they start seeing other people's actions as perhaps a little more aggressive than they might have been intended. They get in more arguments with teachers. There is a real-world antisocial behavior. They get in more physical fights. There is a real-world aggressive behavior. And they get worse grades. Now, if you're a good skeptic, and I want you to be, you'll say, Doug, that's not necessarily about playing violent video games. That might be about being a naturally hostile and aggressive child, because naturally hostile children see the world in terms of hostility. They get in more arguments, they get in more fights, they get worse grades, and they play more violent video games. That's all true. So in this study, we measured children's personality trait hostility. And if we split them into quartiles, and we take the 25% lowest naturally aggressive children, if they also don't play a lot of violent video games, only 4% of them have been involved in a fight in the past year. That makes sense, right? They're not naturally aggressive, they're not playing violent games, they're not getting into fights. But if we take these same low hostile kids, but the ones who play a lot of violent video games, it's an almost 10 times increase in their risk of getting into a fight. Now, if we look at the other extreme, the most naturally aggressive children, these are the ones you would expect to get into fights. If they don't play violent video games, 28% of them have been involved in a fight in the past year, and if they do, it's a bad combination at 63%. Now, what fascinates me here is these two bars here, the middle two. Notice that the least naturally aggressive children are more likely to get into fights than the most naturally aggressive children if these ones play a lot of violent video games, and those don't. What we're really seeing here is the stacking of risk factors. No one thing accounts for aggression, but what you can predict is when you have multiple risk factors, the odds go up. Did you have a question? We used in this study a scale from the MMPI personality test called the Cook and Medley Hostility Questionnaire, and this measures what it's supposed to measure is personality trait hostility. It's a highly validated instrument. Yes? 13 and 14. Now, in this study, we split out how much time they were playing from whether they were playing violent video games. And what we see is that children who spend more time playing are getting worse grades. But notice there is no direct relation between amount of play and antisocial and aggressive behaviors. But because children who play a lot also tend to play a lot of violent games, or are more likely to, those increase their hostility, which in turn seems to predict all three of these outcomes. But over and above this mediated pathway, if they were playing violent games, that added extra predictive power to whether they got into physical fights. Parents tend to be concerned about one of two things. They tend to either care about how much time their children are playing, or about what the content of the games is. What studies like this show is that both matter, but they matter for different reasons. Now, this is a study of 3,000 children between, if I recall correctly, 3rd or 4th grade and 8th grade, and we followed them for 3 years. And what these are is longitudinal latent growth curves. What this is at the beginning of the study. This is the intercept. Where children start, how much they're playing violent games. And the S is the slope, how much they change across the 3 years to play violent games. And down here is where they start in aggressive cognitions. In this study, we measured 3 types of aggressive cognitions. One is hostile attribution bias, which we already talked about. The second is called normative beliefs about aggression, which is how acceptable you think it is, how normal it is to be aggressive when provoked. So if someone hits you, is it okay for you to hit them back? And the third is aggressive fantasies. How much time you spend thinking about how you'd like to hurt other people. And what we find is that if they started off the study playing a lot of violent games, they also started off with higher aggressive cognitions. If they changed to play more violent games, they changed to have more aggressive cognitions. And of course, what you think can show up in your behavior. And that's what we find is that as their aggressive cognitions increased, they were more likely to be physically aggressive at the end of the study. But even over and above that pathway, we still find this extra predictive kick from just how much they play violent video games to begin with. And I think this study is particularly instructive because it helps us to understand how the effect can work. Think about this child who's spent a lot of time playing violent video games. He's been hyper-vigilant, practices being very vigilant for aggression in his environment. As soon as he sees something on the screen that might be an aggressive encounter, he quickly reorients his attention. He calls to mind possible ways of responding to it. He enacts a response and then gets rewarded for it, particularly in a violent game. He's getting rewarded for aggression. So that should change his normative beliefs, how acceptable it is. It changes how quickly he assesses a situation to be aggressive. So now you look at this child in school, and he gets bumped in the hallway. Instead of assuming it was an accident, he now assumes the person meant to make him mad. He quickly changes his attention, and he calls to mind possible ways of responding. Well, what humans usually do is the thing we've practiced the most. That's usually the first thing that comes to, thing that comes to mind first is the thing we've practiced the most, which will, in the case of a high violent game player, he will have practiced aggressive responding thousands of times. And then you can see how the odds have changed. Rather than just letting it go, the odds have shifted a little bit where he's more likely to say something unkind or push back, right? What's really interesting here is if he does, that aggression that happens in the school hallway looks nothing like what he practiced in the games. Children are not copying. That's not how the effect happens. It changes the way we perceive the world and the way we think. And you take the way you think with you everywhere. Yes?
Similar rewards for aggressive behavior. I'm thinking being a stockbroker, an athlete, anything that would in similar ways do that. And would you look at them the same way?
Yes. That this is just basically it's learning, right? Your grandmother was a great neuroscientist. She told you in English, practice makes perfect. I don't know if you have a similar phrase in Sweden. But basically, she was right. Whatever we practice, we get better at. And so if you play a sport where you get rewarded for behaving aggressively, then that becomes more a part of you. But also the flip side, which is if you play games, and I'll show you some data in a moment, that reward pro-social behavior rather than aggressive behavior, we see the opposite effect. Now, in the literature, you often see that people pose these two types of studies as if they're opposites, that these violent games might actually be good for you because they improve your visual attention and spatial processing skills, or that they're bad for you because they can increase your aggressive behaviors and thoughts. And there is also a third group who say video games have no important effects at all. So I think that these are not competing hypotheses. They can both be true at the same time because the brain does many things all at once. And so we did a study in a brain scanner with college-age men who all were high gamers. They all spent at least 10 hours a week playing video games, but they were in two types. Half of them played a lot of violent first-person shooter games, and the other half didn't like that type of game. They played other games, like strategy games. And we put them inside the brain scanner, and we had them play the same game either with the violence turned on or off. So it was a capture the flag variant of game. The goal was the same. The way you used the controls was identical. But in one case, there were other people running around shooting at you, and you could shoot back. And in the other case, there were other people running around. They didn't shoot at you. You had a little frisbee gun. You could shoot at them, but it didn't harm them. And I assumed that we might see differences in emotion regions of the brain. from this, that when the violence is turned on and you're seeing blood spraying and body parts flying off, that you would have an emotional reaction to that. And when we looked at the participants overall, we found no effect at all. But when we split them into the two types, the gamers who normally did not play these types of violent games had very strong increases in emotional processing areas of the brain. So they were having a large emotional reaction to the violence when it was turned on. In contrast, the gamers who normally did play this type of game, it wasn't they had no effect from baseline, they were actively suppressing these regions of the brain. And so when you put them together, it looks like there's no effect. Now, is this desensitization? Is it the neural basis by which desensitization happens? Is it a purely functional response? We don't really know exactly how to interpret it. When we looked over at spatial areas of the brain, the gamers who normally did not play this type of fast-paced shooter game, they brought a lot of additional resources online in their spatial attention navigation regions of the brain. The gamers who normally did play this type of game, however, they stayed the same from baseline. They've already practiced it. They didn't need any additional resources. So the conclusion I draw from this is that this is neural evidence for both a spatial navigation benefit and desensitization all at the same time. The study does say, however, that it's, the third hypothesis, that there's no important effect, that doesn't seem to make sense. Now, as I mentioned, what you practice in the game can matter. So if you play pro-social games where you care about other characters, where you help the other characters, maybe that has an effect. And so we've done a few studies on this. I'm just going to tell you about one. We went across 8 different countries in Asia, in the West, and East Europe. And basically, we find the same thing across all 3 regions of the globe, that if people are playing pro-social games, that increases their empathy, which in turn increases their pro-social behavior. And these data that I'm showing you here are cross-sectional. At one point in time, we also, in the same study, included a 3-year longitudinal sample and found exactly the same effect across time as well. There have been many studies on school performance, usually showing that the more time children spend with video games, they get worse grades in school. There are now starting to be some studies showing that with increased time playing games, that may put children at greater risk for obesity. Although there are also some studies showing that if they're playing action games where they have to get up and move around, like Dance Dance Revolution, that actually may decrease the effect. We have some studies now showing that children who play a lot of video games may actually increase their attention deficit problems in school. So in one study, this is of 1,300 families with 3rd through 5th grade children. So that's about 9, 10, and 11-year-olds in the US. We measured them about a year apart, and we were able to talk to the teachers to find out which children had attention problems. And at one point in time, if children spend more time watching television and playing video games, they also are more likely to have attention problems as rated by their teachers. Attention problems tend to be stable, so if teachers saw attention problems in 1 year in school, the next teacher the next year also saw them. But over and above that, if the year before they were spending a lot of time playing video games and watching television, that increased their attention problems the next year. We also have some additional data showing that it can be a bidirectional relationship, that children with attention problems seek more video games, but then the more video games seems to push their attention problems up, and so it becomes a negative spiral. There are studies on physical health. Children are gaining repetitive stress disorders at a much earlier age than ever before. There's even a form of tendinitis called nintendinitis. It's a thumb injury from too much of this. Some of you may know this is the study, the only study of mine that video gamers like, that we measured laparoscopic surgeons. And a laparoscopic surgeon is the type of surgeon who doesn't have her hands inside you. She makes 2 or 3 centimeter long holes and sticks a light in through one, a camera in through another, and then does the surgery. And she's looking up at a screen and performing this, the surgery on a screen. And we got surgeons who were coming in for advanced surgical training. And they went through a number of timed and scored drills to see how good they were, as well as they were practicing these new skills. And so we were able to actually measure who's a better surgeon without putting any patients at risk. But we also gave them surveys about their previous video game play, and we also had them play 3 video games just to see how good they were at those games and get their scores from that. And what we found is that surgeons who had played video games in the past for at least 3 hours a week were 27% faster and 37% better. Now, those two don't usually go together in surgery, right? You don't want your surgeon rushing. Usually being fast doesn't mean fewer errors, but in this case, they were faster and made fewer errors. But the real surprise in this study is that when we looked at what predicted who were the best surgeons, how good they were at video games now, and how much they had played video games in the past were the best predictors of their actual surgical skill. That was better than how many years of training they had had. That was better than how many surgeries they had actually performed in their careers. So if you need a minimally invasive surgery, I still think your first question should be, how many of these have you done? But maybe your second question should be, are you a gamer? And then a field of research that's really taken off in the past 10 years is looking at what's being called video game addiction. I did my first study on this back in 1999 because even back then we were talking about it, and I thought it couldn't be true. It turns out I was wrong. In a national study across the U.S. with over 1,000 8 to 18-year-olds, surveyed all the way across the U.S. by a polling organization, Harris Polls, which is a fantastic national polling company. We found that about 8.5% of youth gamers would be classified as addicted if we use a clinical definition similar to the way, say, pathological gambling is defined. And is that a lot? Is that a small number? Is that a big number? Is that a small number? Well, it means 92% of youth gamers aren't addicted. Good. So most people who play games don't get addicted. In the US, we have 40 million children. About 94% of them play video games. If 8.5% of them are addicted, that means over 3 million children are taking serious damage to their lives because of the way they're gaming today. But because we don't recognize this yet as a serious medical issue, they're not getting help yet. Now, one of the questions that many people have had, including myself, is, well, what comes first? Is the game addiction a primary problem or a secondary problem? You could imagine that maybe children who aren't doing well in school, don't have a lot of friends, they get depressed. What do they do with that depression? Well, they go home and they play video games as a way to cope with it. Now, that doesn't help their school performance, and that doesn't help their social skills, so they don't gain in those things, so they stay depressed, so they game more. So maybe the problem's really the depression and not the gaming. So we measured, again, 3,000 children across 3 years, and this is a longitudinal latent class analysis. The cutoff for being considered addicted to games is 5 symptoms, and some of the children at the beginning of the study were over that, but by the end they had stopped being addicted. Some of the children started below it, but by the end of the study, 2 years later, had become addicted. Some of them started addicted and stayed addicted, and most of the children, of course, never reached that clinical level. This allows us to look at what comes first. Why is it these ones were able to stop? Why did these ones become addicted and those ones didn't, even though they started with the same number of symptoms? And then what happens at the end? So we can start teasing out the risk factors from the outcomes. And I was surprised by these results. They showed the opposite of what I expected. What we found is that at the beginning of the study, the things that predict how many pathological gaming symptoms they have and how they change across the years of the study is predicted by how impulsive they are. That's perhaps not surprising. More impulsive children were more likely to have symptoms. Lower social competent children also had more symptoms, and if they spent more time gaming, that also increased their symptoms. As their symptoms increased, however, their depression increased, their social phobias increased, their anxiety increased, and their grades got worse. If they stopped being addicted, their depression lifted, their anxiety lifted, their social phobias lifted. So it looks like, at least from these data, that in fact the depression and other mental health outcomes are a result of the gaming, not the other way around. Now, I think actually what we're seeing here is comorbidity, that with most mental health issues, when you get one, you get another, and then they start pushing each other. And I think that's what we're really seeing here, is that certainly the games aren't just a symptom of some other problem, they become part of the problem. Now, that's a pretty complicated list. Lots of different things. They don't look like the same type of effect. How do we put them all together? Yes? My wire being in trouble? Thank you. So how do we put these together? The surgeon study was the one that opened the door for me, because I had been doing most of my research looking at either the amount of gaming or the content of gaming, and I couldn't explain that study with either of those. These surgeons, although amount was related to surgical skill, the top end was 3 hours a week. That's way less than the normal child. If those surgeons had played that as much as an average American child, they wouldn't have gotten into medical school. So I couldn't explain it, and they weren't playing surgical simulators. They were playing the same games you and I play. So that made me realize there are at least 5 dimensions on which games can have effects on players. The amount, the content, the structure, the context, and mechanics. And I'll talk about each of these. So what we find with amount is that overall, if you spend more time playing games, that tends to predict poor school performance and more attention problems. It also may be related to several health outcomes, such as obesity and addiction. And yet, just total amount isn't the entire story. One of the things we know that makes for good learning is if you distribute your practice. So if you're trying to learn to play piano, and you play 20 minutes a day, you will actually learn better than if you play 140 minutes on Saturdays. So the same amount of time, but if you distribute your practice rather than mass it, you actually learn it better. And of course, this is the way many people play their video games, right? They play some each day, and so they would probably learn better from that. And we do have some evidence in one study of violent games that it does look like if they distribute their practice, then the aggression transfers more. But it's not just what does the amount of time do. I think it's also what is not being done. And people are always liking to talk about how the world has gotten worse. And I'm always very skeptical of these claims. But if we think about how children use their time, and these are data from America, in 1950 there were 168 hours in a week. That has not changed, not even here in Europe where you use metric hours or something like that. And so if we think about where children spend their time, let's say they get too little sleep, right? They have 7 hours a night of sleep, and the research shows that children tend to need 9 to 10 hours a night. But let's say they're cutting it back. So 49 hours isn't sleep. Let's say all the things you do to take care of yourself, bathing, dressing, eating, things like that, takes another 3 hours a day. And then you're going to school for 30 hours a week. That leaves 68 hours for everything else you might care about, whether children spend time reading, playing, spending time with family, going to church, learning an extra skill, playing sports, playing music. Any of these things have to fit into that remaining 68 hours a day. And in 1950 in the US, that's how much time children had. As television started encroaching on their time, it started cutting into it. Video games are actually up over 13 hours nowadays, the most recent surveys, and computer use not for school purposes is at 10 hours a week. That means the average American school-age child now has only 14 hours left for anything of value. And that's the average. That means half the children have less time than that. So I think actually this is one of the few places where I agree. Yes, things are very different than they used to be in the past. So it's not just what do the games do, it's what you're not doing when you're playing games. What are you not learning? As far as content goes, well, the content effects are specific to whatever the script elements of the game are. So if you play reading games, you gain reading skills. Math games increase math skills. Health games increase health knowledge and health compliance behaviors among the players. Violent games increase aggressive thoughts, feelings, and sometimes behaviors. Pro-social games increase empathy and helpful and cooperative behaviors. Those are the two that we know the most about, probably. Then these next three are a little more interesting, perhaps, because we don't talk about them as much. So the structural effects of the game, what do I mean by this? Well, there's a thing in communications research called formal features. And this is how things are structured on the screen. So if you imagine a television show where a man and a woman go into a bedroom, close the door, and it fades to black, we take away a specific meaning of what we think happened behind that door. If the same man and woman go behind the same door, close it, and it cuts, it just jumps to another scene, we don't take away the same meaning. That's interesting. The content is identical, but whether it's a fade or a cut jump changes its psychological effect. So the way things are structured on the screen can actually change the psychological effects. So some games require constant scanning, and that seems to be part of what's related to these studies showing that visual attention skills can improve. Some games require that you get three-dimensional information out of a two-dimensional screen. You're looking at a flat screen, but you have to navigate three-dimensional landscapes. And that, of course, is one of the things the laparoscopic surgeons need, right? They're looking at a flat screen, but if they push their scalpel in 1 centimeter too far, the patient dies. They have to be very careful about the three-dimensional information, even though they aren't seeing something in 3 dimensions. Not only that, some games require that you maintain orientation in 3-dimensional spherical space. So if you play, for example, a Star Wars video game where you're fighting, dodging in and around ships, you have to know what's behind you. You have to know what's above you. And as you turn, you have to maintain your orientation like that. And this is another of the skills the surgeon needs, because she needs to know not only what's in front of the camera, but what's behind it. Because if you pull your scalpel out in the wrong direction, the patient dies. And so these are all skills that can be trained through the way the game is designed and structured on the screen. And then if we wanted to increase transfer of learning from the games to the real world, the more realistic we make it to the real world, usually that should increase the speed with which learning happens and transfer happens. So if you're playing racing games and you play it, you actually buy one of the steering wheels and pedals for your feet, that should translate to your real world driving more than if you played the same amount of the same game but on a mouse and keyboard. The fourth effect is of context, and we could mean many different things by context. Some games, for example, require that you cooperate in a big team to solve a puzzle, and that could change the effect. So if you're playing a violent game and you're playing it with your friends, maybe the aggression effect is increased because you're getting social support from people you care about to behave aggressively. Or it could have the opposite effect, because you go to the game with a pro-social motivation to help your teammate. Maybe that mitigates the aggression effect. We don't know the answer to that. Here's a dissertation for somebody. So you could also play the same game in a couple different ways. In Halo, you can play a capture the flag game in Slayer mode where you just shoot anyone. Or you play in a team where you're supposed to only shoot the other team and not your team. Both cases are probably equally violent, the equal amount seen on the screen, and yet maybe they have different effects because of, again, of that shift of psychological perspective in it. Many of these games also present very complicated problems that require what looks awfully like scientific reasoning to figure them out. If you go and read the bulletin boards or the game boards of many of these games, you'll see people talking about how do you defeat this level, and here's what they tried, and this, and then they changed this, and then they changed this. Sometimes people even put up spreadsheets showing exactly, how they worked out the problem. And so that's, in education, that's considered problem-based learning. It's one of the things that a lot of schools are working towards is where you give kids a complicated problem, you put them in a team, you don't tell them how to solve it, and let them work it out. And that can train scientific reasoning skills. And so it may be that this type of game would be good at that. There's just a little bit of research that does suggest that maybe that does work. Now, although I'm talking about these 5 dimensions independently, they're not truly independent. For example, context interacts with content. If you play a massively multiplayer online game, you can play it by yourself and never do anything with another player. But there are parts of the game you'll never get to see then. Some parts of the game you can only see if you're going in with a big team. So the content is dependent then on the context in some cases. And then finally, what do I mean by the mechanics? Well, whatever the input device is, you will learn how to use it. So if you play on a mouse and keyboard, you'll get better at those. If you use the Wii controller, you'll get good at that. If you use the Xbox, with 34 buttons, you'll get good at that. And these can be used also, again, intentionally. Many doctors are using the Wii balance board to help people regain a sense of physical balance after they've been injured. Again, the closer these are to reality, the greater the transfer from the game world to the real world should be. I already mentioned this about driving games. My favorite game of all time that also seems to show this to me is Beatles Rock Band. And I had to have this the day it came out. I'm a big Beatles fan. And I learned that I hate playing the guitar controllers because I do play guitar and I do play bass. And pushing buttons and toggling a little switch, that is just annoying. But I've never been a good drummer. I could play any 2 appendages I could do, but if I put in the 3rd, it all went to hell. After 1 day of playing Beatles Rock Band on the drums, all of a sudden I had my 3rd. And now, after playing this game for a year, I actually can sit behind the drums in my band and hold down a basic, I can play drums in my band, not well, but much better than I used to be able to, and it's because of this game, because the drum controllers are much more realistic to how you play drums than the guitar controllers are. Now again, although we can talk about these independently, they are not truly independent. Mechanics are related to structure, that as you move your fingers, what you see on the screen changes. As you see things on the screen change, you change the way you use the controller. It's that feedback loop we sometimes talk about as hand-eye coordination. And so as far as mechanics go, this is an actual car. This is not just a concept car. They have built this. I guess it is a concept car, but they have built it. What do you notice about its interior? There's no steering wheel. Yes, that's the steering wheel. It's a joystick. So this may be the future as we all become more used to these types of controllers. So the benefits to me of thinking about these 5 different dimensions are it gets us away from this horrible way of thinking about games as good or bad. If your child spends a lot of time playing Grand Theft Auto, the lot of time probably means poorer school performance. The violent content probably means greater aggressive thoughts and feelings, which could in turn predict greater aggressive behaviors in the future. Because it's both a driving and a shooting game, and navigating through three-dimensional environments, etc. Your two-dimension to three-dimension transfer skills should improve. Your targeting skills should improve. If you play it by yourself, it might have different effects than if you play with a group of friends, which might, say, enhance or mitigate the aggression effect. And if you play on a mouse and keyboard, your mouse and keyboard skills will improve. So is it a good game or a bad game? Well, it's a brilliant game, but depending which of these 5 effects you care about, that's how people seem to make this decision. It has both positive and negative effects all at the same time. So this allows us to understand how these multiple effects can happen at once. It provides testable scientific hypotheses. And if we were trying to design games to have the greatest effect, we would want to take account of all 5 of these dimensions so that we made sure the game was designed for maximum impact. And then ultimately, I also hope it helps parents have a more thoughtful response, because they tend to, again, be fairly simplistic in what they care about. And then if they don't like something about the game, they may have a fairly disproportionate reaction to it. But if they understand there are multiple things going on, maybe they can have a little more nuanced reaction. So the conclusion ultimately I draw is that we're talking about learning. The brain learns whether you want it to or you don't. Whatever you practice, you get better at. You can't stop that. You see something once and you've learned. You've seen me once today and you have learned things. If you saw me over and over and over and over again, you'd get really bored with me. And boredom is a sign of learning, that we habituate to things. And so the more we practice anything in a game, we will learn from it, whether or not you're trying to. And so that suggests we do need to pay attention to the games we're playing. We need to pay attention to the content. But the good news is that's something we have some control over. And so in another study, we measured 1,300 families. We talked to the children, we talked to the parents, we talked to their teachers, we talked to the school nurses. We got rich data, and across a school year, what we find is that the parents who put more rules on children's media use, so they set limits on the amount and the content of children's media use, well, that has an immediate effect of those children do spend less time with television and video games, and they consume less violent media. And that's at October in a school year. We followed them up again at the end of the school year, and we found that the parents who had set more limits on amount and content of media at the beginning of the school year, these children were now getting more sleep at the end of the school year, which in turn related to lower weight gain. So these children were now at less risk for obesity. They were getting better grades in school. They were more helpful and cooperative as rated by their teachers, which is remarkable because the teachers don't know what the rules are for children's media at home, but they can see the behaviors in school, and they also saw that these children had lower aggressive behaviors. Now, there are 2 things that fascinate me about this. The first is these are not the same type of variable. This is physical health, school performance, and social wellness. Those are not the same types of outcomes. And yet this one simple thing of setting limits on amount and content of media influences all of them. So it's this ripple effect that spreads out wide, and it spreads out across time. But the more interesting thing to me is that no parent will know they're having this effect, because you will never know that your child has gained less weight than he would have. You can't know that your child is getting better grades than she would have gotten. You can't know that your child is more pro-social than he would have been. You only know what your child is. And this is why parents feel they have no power, because all they see is the fight, right? All they see is the argument over the media. They don't actually see the effect they're having because you can't see it from within it. You have to stand outside of it as a researcher to be able to see it. Yes?
I think we'll take the questions after.
Well, I'm just about done, so this is a reasonable time. So the question was about total screen time, and did we split out? In this study, we did not split out video games from this. This includes video game time and television time. It might even include computer time. I don't recall specifically this study. We did not split them in this. In other studies, we have just looked at video games. The effects tend to look the same. But I think in terms of, if we're trying to give parents useful information, the effects of games don't seem to be very different from the effects of TV or effects of movies or DVDs. So the effect, across, we've been studying media's effects since the 1960s, and the effects seem very consistent across most media. The differences are reading and music seem to have lower effects than screen media. So I don't think at this point it's really important to try to tell parents, do something really different with gaming than with the others. We initially, when I started this research, we thought that games might have a bigger effect than passive media like television or movies, because you're an active participant, you're actually getting rewarded, you get immersed in the game in a way that perhaps you don't in a television show. There just doesn't seem to be, at least this has been tested the most with violent games and against violent TV or movies, and it doesn't seem to be a different effect. It's within the margin of error. If you ask my colleague Craig Anderson, he says, yes, games have a little bigger effect. My reading of the same data is, it's about the same. It's certainly not much bigger, if it is any bigger. So I tend to say we should be counting all of children's screen media. So DVDs and iPhone and iPad and handheld video games and console games and online games and television and total that all up. And, because that's perhaps it's a difficult number to get in some ways, but it's an easier thing for perhaps a parent to wrap their head around, that they're just trying to control total screen time. The American Academy of Pediatrics generally recommends between 1 to 2 hours of total screen time a day for not school purposes. If it's for school purposes, that's free. Mm-hmm. Yes. So that is the end of my prepared talk. So do you want people to speak into the microphone for questions? Or how do you wish to moderate?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Douglas. Go ahead. Now, do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah.
You speak very little of the difference between boys and girls in the different research results. I'd be interested to hear more.
Sure. The question is that I didn't talk about differences between boys and girls. The reason is I almost find no differences. Girls play less, and they play different types of games. But let's say violent games. So girls are much less likely base rate to play violent games, and they are less likely to be physically aggressive. But the girls who play violent games are the girls who hit. So the slope of the effect is the same. They're just at a lower base level. But when they play the games, they are influenced the same way. I didn't tell you the countries of all the studies, but I've been doing studies all across the world. And some cultures are more aggressive than others, and so we might expect maybe a larger effect in those cultures. I don't find that. We talk to these really polite Japanese kids, and still, if they're playing violent games, they are the more aggressive kids. I see no important differences among groups that replicate. Every now and then in a study, I'll find a little difference, but the next study, I don't find the same one, so they don't seem to be robust. And at first, this was surprising to me, and then when I thought about it a little longer, it stopped being surprising. What are we talking about? We're talking about learning. Do girls learn differently than boys? No. Do Japanese children learn differently than Australians or Chinese or Bosnian or Swedish or American? No. The brain learns from what it does. And so almost all of these effects are just learning. They're practice effects. And so it's not surprising that I find no important differences between boys, girls, ages. Adults are influenced the same way in my studies as the children. And again, this is learning. It shouldn't really surprise us.
When you started doing research on addiction, you didn't really believe it could be addiction. Can you describe what changed your mind?
Well, the data changed my mind. When I did my first study on this, like I said, I think it was in 1999, even back then, parents were talking about their children being addicted to games, and I thought that can't be right. Because addiction means more than you do it a lot, right? And I thought all parents mean is my child spends a lot of time playing and I don't know why. But that's not an addiction. An addiction means you're dysfunctional. You're damaging your ability to function. And it can't just be in one area, because anything you love, you will sacrifice some other area of your life. If you love to golf, you will sometimes skip out of work a little early to go golf, or you will refuse to do something with your spouse on a weekend because you'd rather go golfing. And does that damage your work and your relationship? It could. So anything you love doing, you will actually take some damage somewhere else in your life often for. So it can't just be damaging one area. It has to be damaging multiple areas. Your social functioning, your occupational functioning, your emotional functioning, your family functioning, your psychological functioning. It has to be damaging multiple areas to count as an addiction. And I thought, no gamer is going to rise to that level. And so I created a scale based off of the way we define pathological gambling. And you need 5 or half or more of the symptoms. I thought, no one's going to reach that level. And I kept being wrong. Every sample that I studied, whether it was college students who are high-functioning adults, right? You would expect, if they made it to college, they must be doing fine, and yet still, in those samples, about 5% of college students would classify at that level. This national study that I showed you, that was the one that really made it clear to me, it sure looks like an addiction. And all this, I've done many other studies since, and there are many other labs around the world doing studies, and they all keep looking the same, that yes, there are a small subset of gamers for whom addiction's probably the right word. There's a question up there. Yeah, it's the one time in my career where I went into a study with a motive to try to show something wrong, right? Or to show something right. I thought I knew what the answer was going to be, and yet, the data proved me wrong.
Thanks. You mentioned, you answered one question I had already, which was that the addiction scale was something you developed yourself.
Many people have developed different scales.
Yes. You said it was based on pathological gambling. Is that from the DSM criteria?
Yes, that's the one I used. DSM, so there's a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual from the American Psychiatric Association, which in the US is the primary way we diagnose all mental health disorders. They just came out a couple of years ago with the new update, DSM-5, and they now included, on the basis of some of this research that they've called it internet gaming disorder, is a potentially, real thing. There's not quite enough research yet to move it into the main body, but they've moved it into the appendix, showing that the early research looks strong. We need some more before we know exactly what it is. They've now defined it with 9 symptoms rather than 10, and so there are also new scales that hew very closely to their new definition as well. I've used multiple different scales. I've created a couple different versions of them, and academics love to fight over this stuff. My answer is, it doesn't matter what scale I've used. The results look the same over and over again, which is good, because if I could only show it using one special way of measuring it, then I don't really trust it's a real thing, because it's not very robust. But the fact that no matter how I measure it, I keep finding the same results makes me think this is a real phenomenon. And so the when we fight over how to define it, that's just pointy-headed academics, trying to, puff up their chests and say mine is better than yours. Good.
Harassment in online gaming, do you see an explanation of that in your research?
So I have not directly studied harassment within games. I have done some studies on cyberbullying, so that would include it, but it's also broader than that. You could cyberbully through websites or through text messages or Snapchat. And we see it's very early research, so I'm not quite sure what we're going to find ultimately. We do see some things that make a lot of sense, like children who are more aggressive are more likely to cyberbully. Children who have been cyberbullied are more likely to do it themselves. That one of the things in traditional bullying is that if you are a big, strong kid, and there's a strength differential between you're more likely to bully a little weak kid if you're bigger than they are, and you're less likely to bully the kid who's bigger than you. We find a similar thing in cyberbullying, that if you believe that your technical skills are better, I'm better at hacking your website or hacking your Facebook than you're going to be, I'm more likely to cyberbully because I think I can get away with it, and you won't be able to fight back as well. So we're seeing some things like that, but the research is still very young in this area. There was a question here too.
Yes, you said there was very little difference between the effects of gaming regardless of age. But does that also apply to addiction?
I don't know. I would be surprised if it did. So, because adults have more resources. So the children tend to, think about young children. As soon as they get frustrated, they hit, or they throw a tantrum. And as they get older, we get less, the most aggressive people on the planet are 4-year-olds. If by aggressive you mean willing to hit. And we get less aggressive as we get older, not because we don't get frustrated, but because we have more ways of dealing with it. Similarly, teenagers, some of the addiction research, not about games, but substances, seems to suggest that maybe teenagers are at higher risk than other ages because they're higher risk takers just due to what's happening in the brain. They overestimate the benefits, they underestimate the consequences, they're not good at understanding. They don't have good executive control, so they take more risks. And so maybe they're more likely to become addicted. We see this, for example, in smoking. Only 20% of adult smokers began as adults, whereas it's much higher likelihood to get them addicted if you start them as teenagers. So I might expect that maybe adults are less likely to become addicted to video games just for similar reasons, but there, to my knowledge, have not been any studies that have directly tested that. Most of my studies have been on children or young adults up to 22. So I don't have any older adult data really to be able to compare, or I have very little. So that may be a different effect because that's not just a learning effect. That's, how do I learn to cope with my emotions? Well, adults have more resources for that. How do I learn to control my impulses? Adults are better at that than young kids. But maybe someone in here knows some data that suggests this one way or the other.
If there are any more questions, I think we'll take them during the panel discussion, and we will move on for the next speaker. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Gentile.
Thank you.